of the day called the Mirror Games Across the Atlantic. We were hoping to have three speakers, but one of them, our colleague Eve, who was here yesterday, is feeling sick this morning, so she's unfortunately not able to join. But let me just tell you that so Eve and one of our other colleague, Valentin Baer, both from France, are in fact finishing a book on illiberal thinkers, which would have been a really nice way to introduce what we'll be discussing today about kind of um, intellectual history of ideas and how they are traveling across the Atlantic. But we will still touch that topic with our two speakers that we have for this panel now, David Bayer from Texas Lutheran University and Grant Silverman from our own program here at GW, discussing the transatlantic connection and especially the special role of Hungary in this transatlantic connection, among other things. So I will first give the floor to David to discuss Viktor Orban's European and transatlantic strategy using soft power to create a Sonderwelle. Sorry, my German is bad. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Viktor Orban and his sort of foreign policy strategy and the way in which he's using these, I guess, soft power networks and think tanks and so forth to sort of advance his. It's part of a foreign policy strategy. I should just preface this. I'm not a political scientist. Actually, I've been now to several of these conferences with political scientists, so I'm used to it now. But my background is actually in theology. I specialize in ethics, and I did a long time ago. I did a lot of research on Hungary, religion in Hungary under communism, and then when Orban came to power in 2010, he did a lot of he discriminated against a lot of religious minorities, and I did a lot of research to sort of tracking that, and so I've become this kind of hungry guy. But it's sort of I'm not sort of through the back door. That's not my original training. Um, but anyway, so now I do it, and right now I'm looking at Hungary, a lot of maybe Hungary and Austria connections. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about Orban's his foreign policy strategy, and it's quite interesting if you. I mean, just listening to the previous session about Russia. I mean, I think in the case of Hungary, there is a very deliberate and intentional state strategy of using think tanks and sort of soft power networks to sort of propagate a good image about Hungary and to increase his image and to change actually U.S. foreign policy and policy in the EU. It's not. I don't think it's very organic. I mean, the various think tanks. So he's got he's got this MCC or this Matthias Collegium or Corvinus Collegium, which was a couple years ago. The government granted it a endowment of 1.7 billion or something like that. All of the Danube Institute, which is another sort of prominent institute there, is basically funded through the Hungarian government, through a foundation that's funded by the Hungarian government. These think tanks are supervised by a guy named Balázs Orban, who's not related to Viktor Orban, who works in the Hungarian government, who's responsible for Hungary's foreign policy. So they're not independent think tanks, right? They're directly under the supervision of the Hungarian government, and um, they are financed directly by the Hungarian government. And there's a lot of so that's it's part of a strategy. Even the and these people who come to these Americans and so forth that come to Hungary and visit, they're getting these big endowment grants from from one of these Orban funded think tanks. There are investigative journalists in Hungary, for example. There's a Hungarian publication Atlátszó, which basically means transparency, which has been trying to track down the influence and there was just an art. I've been talking with the journalist just the last couple of days. They just published an article where they are trying to track the money flowing from the Heritage from Hungary into the Heritage Foundation, and they can't identify the person, but they say that there was somebody who from the Heritage Foundation gave a talk at a conference in Budapest and was received an honorarium of about $100,000. We mentioned Christopher Rufo yesterday. Christopher Rufo had they were able to uncover he had a contract with this foundation funded by the Hungarian government, $35,000. which included he had to write 2 articles in some sort of Western outlets talking favorably about Hungary. The only one these guys at Otlotso could find was one actually in Compact magazine. I saw that when it came out. Um, but that's like you're pushing the line there on being a foreign lobbyist, right? And it's the same with Rod Dreher. So anyway, it's very intentional. That doesn't mean that these people don't have natural aren't sympathetic to Hungary or they don't have their own agency. I mean, I wouldn't say that, but it's part of an intentional strategy. So I think we should. That's my view. I'm not the political scientist, but that's my view, and I think we should look at it that way. So what is the strategy? Well, we can kind of Orban gives these speeches, and people always say they're crazy, and they are long and rambling and a little crazy. But actually, if you pay attention to them, they're not. They're coherent. There's a coherent vision, and you can infer what Orban wants to achieve in terms of foreign policy. And he has this guy. Balázs Orban, who is his political director, who's been working on developing a foreign policy strategy. He's written, and he's open about it. So he's written a couple books. They're in English, and you can get them on Amazon. He wrote one a couple years ago, The Hungarian Way of Strategy, and he just published one this year. It's called Hussar Cut: The Hungarian Strategy of Connectivity. So it's just out this year. They're both published by this MCC Press, which is by the Orban think tank, and so forth. If you look at what Balázs Orban says in his book, you can see Orban saying the same thing or very similar things in his speeches, and you can really put together what his foreign policy strategy is. And basically, what I think his foreign policy strategy. This is my distilling of it. Orban is trying, it's a Sonderweg, it's a kind of third way thinking between East and West. Orban wants to steer between the East and the West, between the EU and China and Russia to sort of always navigating his way around, and so that Hungary always ends up ahead. And that's really the kind of strategy, like skillful navigating of between the great powers to advance Hungary or something like this. So if you look at Hussar Cut, Balázs Orban's, I'll spend a little time talking about summarizing the main ideas in the book as far as I can glean them. He talks a lot about connectivity, which it seems to me is basically just another word for globalization, or at least he uses connectivity to describe the sort of the network of international relationships that emerge as a consequence of globalization, the various kinds of connections that arise. He's clearly mostly interested in economic relationships, right? But he also mentions political connectivity and cultural connectivity in passing in the book. And you might think, well, okay, if connectivity is globalization or connected to globalization, and here we have a regime that emphasizes national sovereignty and seems to be very much against the European Union, you might think that connectivity is a bad thing. But it turns out that really, no, it's not. The problem is not connectivity, at least in terms of economic relations. The problem, according to the Balázs Orban, is block formation and the return to what he said Cold War patterns of alignment, which would make it harder for Hungary to maintain its connectivity with whatever China and the EU at the same time. So it's a kind of there's actually a speech. So Balázs Orban has been to these national conservative conferences. You see that you can watch it. You can watch one of his speeches that he delivered at the National Conservative, one of these conferences, and he's talking about kind of, we need to maintain connectivity with China. I mean, he's got a whole argument that's, if you think, it just sort of runs against the sort of like, we got to represent our national interest. I mean, there's just sort of it just sort of like not completely, or I would say it's not completely coherent, right? It's just sort of odd to see him making this argument at a national conservative conference. But basically, what he's trying to do is find a way for Hungary to be able to maintain its economic connections with China and Russia, and also maintain good status in the European Union. And the problem with block formation, or what Orban calls block formation, is that it would make it harder for Hungary to maintain these relationships. So he's got to argue against block formation, and he's got to come up with a general. He can't say, well, we don't want it because it's bad for Hungary. He's got to come up with a more generalizable argument, and he basically presents this argument of Western decline. Right, the West is weak, and his argument is if we go into a confrontation between the West and the East, then the West is going to lose. I got a quote here. He says, this is Balázs Orban, it would be self-evidently suicidal for the entire Western world to narrow its scope and arbitrarily divide the world into blocks, right? So, I mean, you can, I would say this is an ideological argument, by which I mean an argument designed to cover up or represent or make possible certain political objectives, right? I mean, Orban never really defines. I'm talking about Balázs Orban, the West and the East. He equates the West. I think it's clear with the United States, although you figure Western Europe would be there. But he's really talking about military power in the United States. Um, and the East, I guess, is China, but it could be China and Russia, or it could be. It's not, it's not even clear. Maybe it's Eastern Europe because they'll say, well, Hungary sits between West and East, which suggested that he means Eastern Europe. So it's a kind of poorly defined uh, uh, the East is poorly defined. It's not clear where India or Africa and so forth, or South America fit into it. But he just wants to formulate this West-East divide to warn that the West should not, break up the world or return or push the world back into block formation. And I think the effect of the argument is really to provide just ideological justification for what Viktor Orban wants to do anyway, because Viktor Orban wants to do is preserve connectivity with Russia and China. And so it's committed a priori, already to this idea of Western decline, because that has to really be true in order for it to make sense for Orban to maintain these relationships with Russia and China. Viktor Orban now delivered his speech in Romania. He does it every year. Earlier this year, and he even said, "Well, we're standing on the threshold of a major geopolitical change. Like one we haven't seen in 500 years, and China will be the dominant power for the next several hundred years." Or he said something to this effect. I think the way to read Orban's speeches is always it's less really analysis, more than you can just sort of tell. Well, this is what Orban wants to be true. This is the way I read this is the way I read his speeches. It's always kind of sounds kind of weird or far fetched. You say, well, this is what Orban is hoping to be true, or what he thinks should be true if his policy is going to succeed. So, in some sense, Orban is banking on this. Rise of China and decline of the West, because unless that's true, his foreign policy, this sort of way of trying to balance between the two, with East and West, it won't make sense. So won't succeed. So the idea here is the Hungarian strategy, or Orban's strategy, is to maintain the connections between East and West, whatever exactly that means, in the face of emerging bloc formations and in face of the growing confrontation between these blocks. And so to maintain connectivity, and I quote again Balázs Orban, requires the ability to seize opportunities and at the same time to recognize dangers. You have to be really clever and skillful. And so Orban invokes, this is Balázs Orban, the tradition of the Hungarian cavalry, the hussars. And he says that what made the hussars so good was, I'm quoting again, they would strike first, typically against a much larger enemy, using speed and initiative to constantly disrupt the enemy's ranks, right? And this is somehow supposed to be the spirit of the Hungarian strategy. So in the context of connectivity, to employ the Hussar cut means cutting deals that maximize benefits and minimize the risks that are inherent in international relationships. It's a way of trying to maintain this third way. So I quote Orban again. He says, in a globalized world, interdependencies necessarily develop to such a degree that states must manage them. The principle underlying this process is that relative advantages of each dependency must outweigh the relative disadvantages. Everything is negotiate. We negotiate everything over and over, right? So really it boils down to a policy of improvised decision making. You need the clever Hungarian hussar would constantly negotiate, you secure an advantage here, you concede when necessary there. It's a very Hungarian mindset, actually, but you always come out ahead. So even Balázs Orban says we need a decision maker, enhanced leadership. It's going to all ride on the great or very skillful leader, who is obviously Viktor Orban, who will always cut the good deal. So all right, so that's basically the strategy. So somehow they'll always be able to succeed in maintaining connections with both the East and the West in a way that will help help Hungary in the face of growing opposition to this. So I think that this strategy, you have to argue it out a little bit more, but I think the strategy is basically a variation on this third way thinking, or Sonderweg thinking, that was common in Central Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, it's usually associated with Germany, or it's more well known with German thinking, but there was third way thinking was very popular and still has a kind of tradition in Hungary. In Hungary, it's associated with sort of 20th century. They call it the Napi movement, which I guess in German would be the Völkisch, or I mean, it's just sort of this populist movement, which was in Hungary in the early 20th century, and what these NAPI writers were concerned with. I mean, they were focused on problems of Hungary's rural population. They wanted to pursue a path of development that avoided the the evils of liberalism and the evils of communism, and preserved Hungary's national identity as a kind of a third way approach. Uh, so. Okay, that's what that approach is. And so this Hussar cut, at least in terms of its self-presentation, is about maintaining Hungarian independence from great powers in order to pursue distinct Hungarian interests. Okay, that strategy may not have worked in the long. I think historically hasn't worked that well for Hungary. But if that's the Hungarian strategy, all right, of sort of navigating, independence from the great powers, it's clearly very much at odds with Hungary's membership in the European Union and in NATO, because the European Union is premised on European integration, right? That's the premise of it. It wants to bring the nations of Europe together to overcome the kind of developmental differences that once made third way thinking plausible and attractive. NATO is a military alliance intended to protect Europe from, the kind of aggression that we're currently seeing in Ukraine. And so this third way thinking that we see from Orban is basically very transactionally committed to these alliances. And Hungarian foreign policy aims to secure a maximum advantage from each alliance with minimal commitment. It's a kind of double dealing approach. And it's no wonder then that Orban finds himself increasingly at odds with the West, the European Union, and the NATO, because it's a very superficial or transactional commitment uh, uh, to these alliances. So the other dimension of Hungarian, I got to hurry here now, foreign policy is that he wants to develop Hungary into a keystone state, which is basically another word for a regional power. So the idea, it's laid out in this book by Balázs Orbán, is that keystone states or regional powers will exert an outsized influence in the region. A small country which exerts an outsized influence, and exerting this influence, it's able to, tip the scales one way or another in various kinds of conflicts. And so, what does that mean? Well, this is really what's behind a lot of Orban's strategy. If you think about the Visegrad group, these four countries, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, and Poland, what Orban would like is to create a block of sort of and then you have to add in the Balkans, right? This is what's behind Orban's support, I think, for expanding the EU. I mean, on the one hand, Orban is opposed to the EU. He says he wants to leave, but he's really into expansion of the European Union. He wants to bring in Serbia. This stuff about Georgia yesterday I didn't know about, actually was pretty interesting. It all sort of illustrates, I mean, what Orban wants to do is expand the EU to bring in countries that are either, what do we call it, autocratic like his, or at least sympathetic to autocracies. And he hopes to create a kind of bloc which would be able to act as a counterbalance to sort of the Western European countries in the EU in a way that would sort of bring an end to the sort of rule of law mechanisms directed against him, or reduce the infringement procedures, and so on. So he's trying to exert influence that way. So if we return to the issue of soft power, I mean, what Orban is aiming to do with these various initiatives that he's doing through his think tanks and so forth is to, change the policies of Western European countries. In the United States, he'd like to, get rid of a critical United States. He thinks that if he can bring an end to the war in Ukraine, this will release the stress on him from the European Union. It'll make it, if there's less stress, it'll make it more possible for him to maintain this sort of this third way. And so, from his point of view, that's what he's trying to achieve with these, with all of this very, very large scale initiative, sort of a PR initiative in the United States and through the Heritage Foundation and so forth. So, okay, I guess that's it. I ran out of time. So good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And now moving on in a sense, the US side of that is Grant Silverman discussing CPAC importance to the international far right.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Grant Silverman. I am a research associate here at the Illiberalism Studies Program, and I'm going to be presenting research on CPAC as an international phenomenon. So to kind of give an impression of the nature of the research that I conducted, I like to say that it sits somewhere between academic and journalistic. For the historical portion of my project, I spent a lot of time in archives, both here in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress, and then also in Provo, Utah, where the American Conservative Union, which is the sort of parent organization that puts on CPAC as an event, which I'll discuss in a moment, they have their archive in Provo, Utah at Brigham Young University. And so I spent some time looking through the original documents, meeting minutes, correspondence between key organizers, to kind of build out the historical precedent for the American Conservative Union's adventurism abroad, as I like to say. But then I also spent some time going to conferences here in the United States, where I attended 2 CPACs in Washington, D.C., and then also international CPACs in Mexico City in 2022 and Hungary in 2023. Okay. So I wanted to take a minute to briefly describe what is CPAC for those of you who might not be familiar. It's the Conservative Political Action Conference. The name PAC might be a bit of a misguiding kind of idea to follow, because in the United States we also have the notion of PACs and super PACs, which are mechanisms for political funding. To make matters more complicated, of course, CPAC has an action PAC. So for those of you keeping track, that would be the Conservative Political Action Conference Action Political Action Committee. The American Conservative Union also is made up of both 504c3s and 504c4s that do varying political and so-called educational productions. And so CPAC is officially put on as an educational product of the American Conservative Union. I'm not exactly sure how that works abroad and what legal designations might prevent them from campaigning, because in the United States you can't campaign at CPAC. They really kind of skirt the line with that, because in recent years in the United States, CPAC has become little more than a Trump rally. But again, I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation when I talk about the flavor of individual international CPACs. So CPAC offers reactionary and conservative, increasingly reactionary, but at its founding, more conservative voices, a place for public speeches, networking, media opportunities. Of course, a lot of this happens behind closed doors, and especially in an international setting, it's important for kind of the global conservative or reactionary movement politic as it exists to be able to coordinate, especially, and this is especially true in Europe, where matters regarding the European Union and various ideas of Euroscepticism and what to do about that, leaving versus kind of co-opting the European Union, are at play. So to talk a little bit about the DNA of an international CPAC, the ACU, again, the American Conservative Union, is always involved. They're always a co-sponsor of the event. And then a local partner is usually involved. In Mexico City, this was Movimiento Viva Mexico, with its founder, Eduardo Verástegui, who is one of the figures on the kind of banner image for today, or the day's conference. It's a anti-choice organization, and Verástegui himself was at one point a candidate for the presidency of Mexico. Of course, he didn't win, was kind of always a dark horse candidate. But that's no deterrence from CPAC's partnering with such candidates, as Javier Milei at one point was considered similarly a dark horse candidate, and of course is now the president of Argentina. He spoke at CPAC Mexico as kind of the headlining event in 2022. You have the Japanese Conservative Union, which is closely modeled on the American Conservative Union and its president, Jay Aiba. That was actually the very first international CPAC conference that was held. And then you have the Center for Fundamental Rights. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Hungarian, with its leader, Miklos Santo. It's usually 1 or 2 days long. And of course, it's themed to match the local political context of a given country's situation. So sorry, briefly distracted there. So for instance, in the US, like I mentioned, it's become little more than a Trump rally, especially in recent years. In Mexico City, it was overwhelmingly Catholic, which might seem like a kind of a no-brainer given the sort of political and religious context of Latin America. But when I went, I was actually surprised at how prominent kind of Catholic fundamentals, if not fundamentalism, was at play in speeches and also in the nature of the attendees at the conference. So Citizen Go was there, for instance. People were walking around in habits. So there was kind of this Catholic flair. Of course, there was also a strong emphasis on economic relations. A lot of hay was made out of NAFTA, or kind of the post-NAFTA economic situation regarding the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And then in Hungary, the conference was by far the most intellectualized of all of them. People were wearing business suits. There was a lot of talk about, Nietzsche and kind of a Spenglerian flair to the conference. And there was at one point kind of discussion of how you read Marx from the right, which these kinds of discussions are absent at the other CPACs that I attended. So I just wanted to offer a schematic here to show where CPAC has been held. Israel is a little hard to see, but it is on the map. Israel was actually the only, while I'm on the topic, the only conference that was held without the use of a local partner. Japan, of course, the United States being the first in 1974. That's 10 years after the founding of the ACU. And then Japan, followed several decades later in 2017. A number of these countries have had multiple conferences. So there was recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a second conference held in Mexico City. Brazil has been host to 2, Hungary has been host to 3, and so on. Okay, so like I said, this is a partly journalistic exercise, and so we're following the money. I don't have too much more to offer here other than that the production of international CPAC conferences also coincides with the huge jump in funding in 2017. I mean, you had been working your way up to the $9 million number there, but as CPAC has become increasingly an international phenomenon, the ACU has been increasingly well funded. The only thing that I can really point to here is that with the increased exposure, CPAC has more opportunities for revenue streams. It's difficult to ascertain exactly who the biggest donors are, but with the most expensive ticket that you can buy at an American CPAC conference at $20,000, I hypothesize that this is a way for the ACU to kind of hide who their biggest funders are, because you're paying for a ticket, a product, and not making an outright donation. So this is just kind of an interesting model to show that with the increased international prominence comes more money, more power. So I also wanted to talk about CPAC at home, but with an international kind of context. As you may have seen, CPAC in the United States draws leaders from across the world. This is both at the state level. You have people like Orban, Bukele from El Salvador, and Javier Milei have all spoken, but so have the local organizers of international CPACs like Jay Aiba, Miklos Santo from Center for Fundamental Rights, and other kind of sub-state movement conservative leaders have spoken at CPAC. In the United States, increasingly, there's also the matter of great power politics, which has kind of come back into fashion. I went to graduate school here at the Elliott School, and at that time, it was almost a foregone conclusion that we lived in a liberal kind of end of history world. But the rhetoric at CPAC, where aid for Ukraine is kind of questioned as a need because every artillery shell that the United States sends Ukraine is one fewer artillery shell that we have to use against the almost certain coming war with China, is kind of a fixture and center point of the great power kind of dialogue from actors such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and other right-wing elected officials in the United States. So now I wanted to talk briefly about kind of the wider network of CPAC abroad, because of course, the ACU as an organization and as such, CPAC as a locus of political organizing does have, if not explicit partners, kind of a family or a network context that it exists within. The executive director, former executive director Dan Schneider, and current chairman Matt Schlapp are both original signatories of the Madrid Charter. which is a product of the Foro de Madrid, which is sort of an anti-communist, a modern anti-communist organizing bloc that is itself a product of the Fundación Descenso, which is the foundation from the Spanish far-right party Vox. At the CPAC conferences, you have individuals representing the European conservatives and reformists, as well as the former Identity and Democracy. Of course, that has since fallen apart. But when I went to the Hungarian conference in 2023, they had tables, they had speakers to kind of promote their vision for a Europe that was co-opted by the far right instead of abandoned by the far right. And so the title of, so what does this mean for local politics? Pardon me. You see kind of an increasingly flattened right-wing rhetoric across the flattened right-wing rhetoric across sorry.
From both sides.
From both sides. A flattened rhetoric. When I practiced, this didn't happen. Issues like wokeism, which as a linguistic phenomenon, of course, don't exist in Hungarian or Spanish, are clearly recognizable to my English-speaking ears. I still have some.
So hot. Sorry for yeah, it's not in our control. The all air conditioning stuff, it's centralized by GW.
Okay. So some of the kind of phenomenon of American politics are now becoming increasingly relevant abroad, even if, like I said before, the conferences themselves match the political rhetoric that is kind of native to a given country. So the title of today's panel is the Transatlantic Mirror Game. And I ask the question, where does CPAC fit into this? And it's a cycle of intellectual exchange on one hand. So you have things like wokeism now appearing in Hungarian and Spanish and other contexts. And you also have networking opportunities whereby Americans with lots of money can find partners that they're interested in funding and sending them to educational camps. The Heritage Foundation brings people from Hungary to Washington, D.C. to partake in political learning camps. And you have grant-making organizations also funding sub-state political organizing on the right in Europe. So I wanted to offer some conclusions. Will CPAC conquer the world? Probably not. The countries that they have expressed interest in have provided willing partners. The possibility for expansion might follow electoral trends. For instance, someone at one point had expressed a hope that there would be an Italian CPAC conference after the election of Meloni. But CPAC, as a product of the ACU, are both kind of nimble organizations, so they're responsive. At this point, the ACU is, without a shadow of a doubt, a Trumpist organization and almost an extension of his party, and if he should become president, governing apparatus potentially. But if Trumpism should fall out of favor, the ACU will probably be able to recover and realign itself with whatever conservative, reactionary, or right-wing trends are popular in any given moment. As I mentioned before, you have kind of a flattening of the political dynamism that exists throughout the world. So again, I keep coming back to wokeism as kind of the eternal boogeyman of the CPAC conferences. But you have this sort of Americanized style of rhetoric and political organizing being exported abroad. So even if each country has its own issues that it must face, it still kind of is going to be approaching them with an ACU-like mind for solving those problems. And then, of course, you have the networking effect of strengthening the reactionary movements where the where the ACU is involved. So at the risk of standing up here and coughing for another 20 minutes, I'm going to end there, and I look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. Thank you both of you for a really fascinating presentation. And it's also good to see for all of us who have been looking at this transnational connection. We spent so much about the Russian connection and this feeling that, you know, the Western, the transatlantic, the US side was always the kind of forgotten mirror. It's good to see research now arriving. And I think it has been more visible with, of course, the Trump, the Bannon, the Orban kind of connection, this internationalization of CPAC. I think it's really excellent, and we don't have it in the presentation. The people who are participating in the conference, but of course all the kind of long evangelical tradition of going abroad. There is a great book by our colleague Christina Stockel and Dmitry Uzlaner on the Moralist International, looking at the World Congress of Family and all this structure. And so that it's both US and Russia connecting with each other. So there is a rich feed on the kind of Western transatlantic side that I think has been now kind of emergent as an object of research, and your two papers were two great examples of that. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so I'm happy to open the floor and welcome a question. So first there, please, Lorena. Here, Louis, here.
Hi, thank you. My question is for David. It kind of, you were emphasizing this connectivity as an idea between the East and the West in light of these bloc formations, and that Hungary is trying to achieve this level. From the one hand, I was interested in, you described it as very much strategic and transactional. However, I have this image maybe that Hungary is also trying to build an image of an ideological leader as well, or trying to bridge the best of both worlds, or what is good in the ideology of the East and what is good in the ideology of the West, or something like that. Do you think that to be the case or not? And then another question, since I do mostly research on Serbia, also I was wondering, because in Serbia, as another example of this country that has long had this tradition of being between the bridge between the East and the West in Europe as well, I was wondering if there are any references to the non-aligned movement in Hungary. Does it come up ever in these conversations or not? Because this would have been maybe one of the most important, even though it does have this communist or anti-communist position, would they refer to the non-aligned movement at all?
One question. There was one in the back, and then we come to you. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is for Grant Silverman. I'm David Hoffman, former vice president at the Women's National Democratic Club. Yes, men are members. The question for Grant, it has to do with CPAC and its funding. You mentioned that they sort of may intentionally conceal sources of money funding for CPAC or the ACU itself. By these so-called $20,000 packages. I'm wondering, aside from the obscurantism of disguising and concealing funding sources, is there any way, Grant, to determine where fundamentally either the ACU or CPAC, where its funding comes from?
Here.
Hi. So my question is for David, and you talk a lot about this connectivity concept from Bella Shorpen's books, and I'm behind, it's not just rhetoric. There are really concrete projects that they're pursuing in this regard. And I would, play maybe a devil's advocate and offer that a lot of those projects are fundamentally economically very sound. So, for instance, China is upgrading a railway line between the Aegean ports of Greece, and that has, those ports have grown exponentially over the last decade since the China bought them cheaply during the Euro crisis. And they're building this railway as a sort of main supply route into the Central Europe, going to all the way to Budapest. That seems to me, as a Serbian citizen who doesn't like the regime, I think it's a really good project. Both Serbia and Hungary have been getting Russian gas way more cheaply than the Western Europe over the last 2 years. And that's been a big part of their pitch to foreign investors, also Western investors who are coming to these countries in order to, among other things, use this cheaper cost of doing business because of the cheap Russian gas. So also a good economic policy. You can see that, that the connectivity, Hungary has become one of the, best positioned countries in Europe in the green transition because it has South Korean, Chinese gigafactories of batteries for electric vehicles. And you can see that it's a good policy because BMW is investing 2 billion euros to build a greenfield new plant in order to be close to their Chinese suppliers to build electronic cars in Hungary. So I'm just wondering your comment on sort of how do we reconcile this ideological aspect of it, but with this also like this tangible benefits that I think really important part of analysis. And the second question, very briefly, is the how, to what extent is this policy really any more transactional than the policy of the Western Europe? Germany had to be disconnected from the Russian gas by a sabotage action blowing up the pipeline in the North Sea. And so I don't think we should, should we judge the Hungarians so harshly for being pragmatic, just as everyone else seems to be?
Thank you. And a fourth question here, and then I'll give you the floor back.
Mine's just an observation from Australia that the same players who are going to Hungary are also in CPAC, and we have former prime ministers and things like that who are going to Hungary. So it's really at the top. And they've just in this last month introduced abortion politics into Australia, which has been totally absent, and that's particularly linked to the CPAC people.
Sure. Yeah. So about the thing about I do actually think that, I mean, I'm not an economist, okay, but I do actually think there is a kind of rationale. It's not a crazy policy, at least for Orban to have these connections with China. With the, they want to build this factory for batteries or whatever. So I mean, I do think that there is a kind of rational strategy for part of what Orban is doing, right? With at least I can see it with the China. I don't know. I don't think it's true that this is highly disputed in Hungary that in fact Orban gets Russian gas cheaper. I know that's what he says, but so I can't actually state it one way or the other, but that's highly disputed. But as far as the Belt and Road thing, I mean, I don't know about that either. Anyway, I think there is some. I mean, I actually agree that I just was in Budapest a couple of weeks ago, and I made this. I said, well, the Orban being connected with China is rational, and it's not. It may be more in degree, and there's probably a lot more corruption involved in Orban's relationship. But it's not fun. Well, I mean, lots of countries in Europe and it's hard to see how they're going to not have those relationships with China. So, okay, so I'll grant that if you set aside the issues of probably the high levels of corruption and the lack of transparency that's going on with some of these deals with China, I mean, I can see that that's a rational strategy. On the other hand, I don't think that. I mean, that doesn't explain why Orban vetoes every time the EU wants to send money to Ukraine, or it doesn't. Orban talks about so Orban takes sort of an active role in the EU of sort of undermining. He himself has basically a kind of autocratic, or however we call it, hybrid regime, and he's gotten a lot of criticism and pressure, right, from the European Union, and he would like to bring that to an end because basically it's making it. He wants to stay in power. So I don't know why there should be a linkage between. I actually sympathize with the China point a little bit, but I mean that's different from the ways in which Orban is trying to undermine sort of the principles of democratic whatever in the EU. I shouldn't take he talks about Orban talks about economic neutrality, right? This is another aspect of the strategy where he wants to totally disconnect economic trade from issues of what I would call political values. I'm not sure that that's going to work. Okay, but anyway, I'll grant the 1 point. I don't know. Maybe I should. I don't want to take all the time, so you should.
Hi. So regarding the question of kind of following the money and tracking funding, I wish I had kind of a methodological, clear-cut answer to say this is how we're going to go find out who the big donors are. But when I pulled the 990s from ProPublica, that information just simply wasn't available. So if you're thinking about people giving tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, I'm really not sure. My training is not as a journalist, even though I described the project as being somewhat journalistic in nature. So I would imagine that if you got close with individuals from the organization, you could potentially suss out who those big donors were through asking the right questions, but this would take a long time. And I hesitate to say infiltration into the organization, but on its surface, I'm really unsure as to how that could be ascertained.
More questions? So a group of, okay, a new group of 4 questions. So 3 there, and then after you here. That would be all you.
Hi, Dan Trombley, George Washington University. This is a question for Grant. So at the past couple of CPACs in the United States, the more dissident, white, identitarian, and kind of subcultural aspects of the American right who are not totally satisfied with their ability to get their message across at CPAC have had AFPAC, the America First Political Action Conference, usually held, as close as possible to CPAC. I was just curious in your attendance if you had seen interest from the international guests and attendees at CPAC and engaging with this, or is that just too toxic of an event and kind of too mired in internal American intra-right disputes for them to really see much advantage in engaging with it?
Awesome. Julian Waller, George Washington University. For Grant, fabulous project, really cool. CPAC is old, and the American conservative movement has gone through a variety of ideological changes between 1974 and today. CPAC was once dominated by the Reaganite fusionist consensus, at least to some degree, with a very strong emphasis on the free market, individual liberties, things like that, right? To what degree are partner conservative organizations and other foreign nations still tapping into older strains of American conservatism? Like in Latin America, for example, are you getting a lot of sort of neoliberal, business conservative with sort of the social traditionalism as well, but that emphasis, the sort of Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney, back to Ronald Reagan kind of conservatism? Were you getting that in Mexico, for example? And variations on that in these other countries or in Japan as well. And quick question to David, which is also absolutely fabulous and fantastic. I look forward to citing the paper. My one question is about this connectivity thing. So Balázs Orbán came to DC. He spoke at the Hungarian embassy. I went, got a free copy of the book, heard his spiel. The connectivity thing is funny because it's consultant language, and it's very clearly the 2 things are going on. One is that it's a way to package why there's Chinese and Russian economic deals going on. And the other aspect is it's sort of a ballpark way of saying multipolarity without saying multipolarity, given that you're inside the EU and you can't be part of a separate multipolar entity. But when he came and spoke at the embassy, a lot of the focus ended up being on the Ukraine war. And that was clearly not the initial point of connectivity. It was supposed to be a nice little branding exercise. I'm interested in your thoughts on how this concept and sort of the Balázs Orbán foreign policy guru dynamics inside Hungary, how that relates and has changed given the last 2.5 years of war.
Yes, Maria Jimenez from the University of Oxford. I also have a question for Grant. It's kind of a follow-up question to this. You mentioned that wokeism rightly is difficult to translate, right? So, but we're seeing connections between, say, Latin American elites and CPAC. So if you've come across this, what's the most important borrowing, if you like, for Latin American elites from these networks, given that some of the issues that, anti-wokeism, et cetera, maybe doesn't travel as much? If that's the case, what are the ideas that you think travel the most across the region?
Oh, sorry. Hopefully mine is a little easier. So Grant, in your presentation, you said that you don't think that CPAC is going to take over the world, and that's, yeah, sure. But the thing that concerns me, and I'm thinking particularly of the Brazil connection, because I remember hearing people talking during like their version of J6. There were folks online saying like, this looks like J6 because these are friends with people who did J6. Should we be concerned about the corrosive effects of the connections that are made through CPAC? And like, I don't know, do we think that more J6s are possible? I also want to make a really quick plug. It's really hot in here, but I'm finding that I've got a glass of water and I'm putting my hand in it and I feel a lot better.
Then ask on that side.
Yeah, Arsenio Cuenca from the École Pratique des Hautes Études. I had a question for Grant, quick question, promised. Did you find any overlaps between CPAC and the National Conservatism Conference? Because as I see it, the CPAC would be a more political output of the same international illiberalism, whilst the National Conservatism Conference is a more theoretical, intellectual, ideological version of it. So are there any overlaps, exchanges? Thank you.
Okay, I can. So I don't know all the and you read Balázs Orbán, he talks about connectivity, and he's referring to. I don't really know the literature. I don't know what he, so it's just a language that he likes. As far as I can see, he's talking about the effects of globalization. Except that I do think that he uses the. It seems to me he shifts his usage of the term. So sometimes he's using it just to describe the world, okay, but then he starts using it as. I mean, he describes it as performance or decision making, which would seem to be not the condition. That's how you handle connectivity. So, I think it's like not totally clear, anyway, there's some double meaning going on there, because what he thinks the lesson of connectivity is the way to handle a world in which there's connectivity is for Hungary to cut good deals. Okay, so I think that's what whatever he defines connectivity, that's sort of the basic product. The Ukraine thing has, I mean, this is really, I mean, Orban has gotten in he's always been a nuisance, but he's in much worse trouble now with the EU. He's got much greater conflicts with the United States as a result of the Ukraine. And his Ukraine policy is actually hard to understand. It's an ongoing puzzle in Hungary. Why is Orban so pro-Russia, right? I mean, it's what's in it for him? I mean, if he had taken a less public strategy, if he'd been like Maloney, right, or something, where the EU would have left him alone. So it's hard to understand why he's doing it. what's he getting from it? Because he's sharpened the conflict that and you know the explanation he's getting cheap Russian gas, I think, is probably not even true. So it's just hard. Nobody really understands it. It's like a constant topic in Hungary. All right, I don't want to, Hans, so I'm gonna let you go. Yeah.
So a lot to work through here. So to kind of go in order, white identitarianism and international actors, let's call them, and to what degree they sort of flirt with or engage with Americans on that side. Difficult for me to say because I'm not privy to all of the backroom kind of networking meetings that they may be attending. I mean, you had sort of out and out fascist cosplayers at the last CPAC that I attended, along with, I can't remember his name, but the publisher of American Renaissance, Jared Taylor. So certainly these kind of creatures, if I can use a politically charged term, are at CPAC and they have a home there. I mean, Nick Fuentes, kind of the viral, shit poster, was escorted out, but that's only because he's loud and has this degree of notoriety that CPAC as an organization or as an entity, ACU's the organization, which has pretenses to be mainstream, don't want that kind of attention. But if you're subtler, you're quieter, you're like Jared Taylor, and you dress up your racism in science, then they'll let you kind of get by. Now, whether or not international individuals interact with them or even know kind of the degree to which they should or might want to interact with someone like Jared Taylor, I can't say. Certainly not in my observed experiences, but it could be happening kind of behind closed doors. Moving on to kind of the economic question and to what degree fusionism or kind of the remnants of fusionism exist in kind of international rhetoric, we'll call it. I think that that's certainly more at play with regard to Latin American speakers. I mean, certainly you have Javier Milei, who's named his clones of his original Mastiff after the Chicago School economists. And, he's a fixture of the CPAC experience as it's been internationalized, speaking at Mexico City in 2022, having been a guest at other conferences, and speaking at the United States version of the conference this past spring. I think that economic issues overall have a higher degree of salience with regard to Latin America, especially because of the close economic ties between the US and Latin America as a region, especially, again, bringing it back to great power politics where China is concerned. So lots of the right-wing speakers would rather see closer economic relations with China. And of course, Americans want that juicy, juicy lithium in the lithium triangle located in northwestern Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. So there is kind of this spirit of fusionism that runs through the international relations kind of rhetoric of specifically Latin American speakers and those speakers who talk about Latin America. Let's see. Moving on to the woke question, how is kind of wokeism translated in a more tangible way? I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think the primary issue there is sort of gender politics. There was, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there was a Peruvian speaker at the CPAC Mexico conference who gave, in my kind of, again, I'm inserting my own politics, heinous presentation about kind of the gender ideology of the left. And so in terms of cultural artifacts in Latin America as it relates to CPAC, I think gender is the most salient issue. Brazil, January 8th, they had the good sense to have a couple of days in between their anniversary and ours for J6. Whether or not this is something that's just inspired by CPAC or kind of the friends of CPAC, I hesitate to say it's kind of a one-to-one. I think that right-wing reactionary fascist actors in Brazil have their own consciousness about this. I think that certainly the American model provided, it could have provided some inspiration, but if Brazilians were going to storm the capital in Brasilia, they were always going to do that, and I don't think they needed inspiration from Americans to do so. I mean, if you wanted to call it a coup attempt, the United States is far from the first country to have experienced a coup. And so if they were trying to launch something similar, then they could have found that inspiration kind of natively. And then kind of the follow-up to that, are more J6s possible? I mean, this is the kind of prognostication that I hesitate to engage in, but my gut instinct tells me no, because the specific kind of J6 or J8 in the Brazilian context experience proved to be politically unsuccessful. Now, whether or not the United States will elect Donald Trump after his connections to J6, maybe the public is quick to forget what January 6th or January 8th means for kind of an assault on democracy is yet to be seen. I mean, it's a close race either way. So you have Americans and potentially Brazilians when they go to the polls next, who are either willingly or unwillingly forgetting, or it just isn't that big of an issue for them when they make their electoral choices. So I hope that somewhat of a non-answer is also sufficient. Overlap between CPAC and NatCon. I haven't followed the National Conservatism Conference quite as closely, so I'm less familiar with the kind of recurring characters that appear at those conferences versus CPAC. But in the kind of cursory, I would hesitate to even call it research, but the cursory kind of perception of it is that you have more of the European actors who are overlapping between NatCon and CPAC. So again, that speaks to the kind of intellectualized environment that's at play in the European, specifically the Budapest editions of CPAC as kind of being politically salient. And to kind of build on that, in Europe, the economic issues that we see in Latin American speeches are less prevalent. So you have more of the kind of culture wars, gender ideology, anti-woke, anti-globalist, George Soros kind of almost conspiracy theory-like rhetoric at play in those European CPACs where they try and dress it up and, read Marx from the right, that kind of thing. And those are the people from Europe who you see at NatCon, both here in the United States and in Brussels.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion. So I wanted to thank both of you for your great presentation. Before we upload, just wanted some logistics. We will be now stopping for break. Lunch will be served outside. I propose we begin back at like 1 p.m., even if in the program it's 1:15, but we can probably in 45 minutes be done because we have a very heavy afternoon with 8 speakers. So the more we can have some time and some fresh air, the best. So we reconvene in 1 hour, and please join me in thanking our 2 great panelists.